Hi, I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics here at the Daniels College of Business on the University of Denver campus. This is one of a series of videos the Institute is producing based on the quarterly peer-to-peer roundtable events that we host. These events are attended by seasoned business executives, independent directors, advisors to these firms, and selected faculty members. The events focus on issues that are of current interest in the business world in the areas of ethics and compliance, governance and leadership, and corporate social responsibility and sustainability. I think you'll find these interesting videos to watch because they do depict seasoned, experienced executives dealing with issues of current importance to their organizations today. James Cash Penney, the founder of the J.C. Penney department store company, famously said that the soul of business is confidence. Well, if that's the case, it's apparent that American business has lost its soul. Recent studies have shown that the percentage of people who trust their business institutions has fallen to less than 1/2 between 2008 and 2011. And the percentage of people who say they trust their financial institutions has dropped by 46 percentage points during that time. These facts paint a very discouraging picture for the American economy, but they also provide some very significant challenges to American corporations and the executives who run them. These corporations and executives need to know they have the trust of the American people if they're going to rebuild their companies. As the editors of the Harvard Business Review said recently, no organization can be honest with its public if it's not honest with itself. Leaders may need to make a conscious decision to support transparency and to create a culture of candor. On February 9th, 2012, the Institute for Enterprise Ethics hosted a roundtable discussion among business executives, independent directors, their advisors, and some business faculty, talking about the challenges they face in building a culture of candor in their organizations. That discussion was led by Professor James O'Toole, the Daniels Distinguished Professor of Business Ethics.
Up until about 10 years ago, if you spent any time in Aspen, you would have gone to the Crystal Palace, where you would have heard the founder, Meade Metcalf, sing his signature tune, Peanut Butter on the Chin. Metcalf always claimed that he hated the song, but he couldn't resist the fact that all the big corporate CEOs who were there always wanted him to sing it. It's pretty clear why they liked the song. It was about them, after all. And it dealt in particular with the corporate CEO who was rather in a hurry to get to work one morning, sort of feeling that I sort of had myself about half an hour ago. He, after he shaves, he fails to make the proper ablutions, and he's had breakfast, of course, and no time to wash up. And so by the time he gets into work, he's going through a couple of meetings, and then finally gets a chance to go to the restroom, and he notices that he's got a lump of peanut butter on his chin from breakfast. Day passes the whole day with this embarrassing blob there. He goes home and he realizes that he's made a fool of himself in front of his minions, really depressed. Next day, goes in, doesn't know what the hell to expect. And the second stanza of the song has him back in with his top management team, and he looks around, and lo and behold, every single one of them sports a lump of peanut butter on his chin. All right, now, this ode to corporate conformity I found a very interesting introduction to a very serious book that I commend to all of you, Philip Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect. It's a rather chilling account of a Stanford prison experiment that he conducted back in 1971. You probably heard about this storied psychological experiment that got out of hand. Young graduate students had been assigned to play roles of guards and inmates in an ersatz jail in the basement of a Stanford campus building. But the participants took their play acting so seriously that the scheduled 2-week experiment had to be cut short because the guards started to act like real guards, and they started first to psychologically and then to physically abuse the students who were playing the parts of prisoners. Now, the book is the first detailed account of what happened there some 35 years ago. And the retelling was prompted by the terrible events at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, which eerily replicated what had happened at the prison experiment years before. Now, Phil Zimbardo is a very interesting social scientist in that his goal is to understand why good people do bad things. He wants to discover the psychological and the social sources of evil. He begins with a 300-page day-to-day account of all that happened in that hellish experiment back in '71, and then he follows it up with more contemporary review of real-life horrors at places like Nazi concentration camps, My Lai, Jonestown, Rwanda, and currently in Darfur. He looks at these familiar events in the light of 2 decades of social psychological research. Now, in the process, what he does is he turns what he thought we knew about the sources of evil on its head. For years, experts had asserted that people do bad things because they have an inherent disposition or a bent that makes them susceptible to temptations to do wrong. But Zimbardo presents scientific evidence that really very clearly disproves that assumption. It turns out that almost all of us are susceptible to being drawn over to the dark side. Now, the lesson is that human behavior is determined more by situational forces and group dynamics than it is by our inherent natures. Now, good people, that's ones like all of us, can end up doing unspeakable things, things that are out of character for all of us, given such conditions as peer pressure and the phenomenon that is known as groupthink. Zimbardo shows how easy it is to create situations in which really good people cannot resist the temptation to do bad. But he concludes on a very, very hopeful note. He says we can just as readily design systems that lead to positive behavior. Now, unfortunately, in this tremendous research that Phil has done, he mentions business organizations only in passing with some references to WorldCon, Enron, and the Arthur Andersen scandals. But in fact, his general conclusions illustrate the source of unethical corporate behavior a lot more adequately than do most of the published analyses that specifically addressed the issues of these problems in business organizations. What is important is that his conclusions belie the standard explanation offered by business people when people in their organizations are caught misbehaving. That standard explanation is always the same. Hey, there are a few bad apples in any barrel. Now, Zimbardo demonstrates that, in fact, ethical problems in organizations originate with the barrel makers. That is, the leaders who, wittingly or not, create and maintain systems under which participants are encouraged or motivated to do wrong. Tremendous implications for this, because instead of companies wasting millions of dollars on ethics courses designed to exhort employees to be good and do good, it's more effective for managers to make an effort to create corporate cultures in which people are rewarded for doing good things. Now, Zimbardo's conclusions are important for business leaders for a whole bunch of reasons. Not only do they help explain the behavior that led to rather rare travesties like Enron, but more immediately, they shed light on the quotidian organizational problems of pressures to conform and reluctance to speak truth to power that CEOs in Aspen found so hilariously familiar in Peanut Butter on the Chin. Now, in a book a few years ago that came back, my colleague Warren Bennis and her co-author Daniel Goleman and I recently documented how these organizational forces hamper companies' capacity to innovate, to solve problems, to achieve goals, to meet challenges, and even and to compete. We found that there was only one effective antidote, and that is creating organizational cultures of candor in which information flows unimpeded to those who need it, when they need it, and in which no one fears the consequences of speaking truth to power. Experience demonstrates that few companies are characterized by the kinds of organizational transparency that we're talking about here, Yet, the good news is that potential benefits of transparency are great. An Inc. survey indicates that companies with high transparency ratings financially outperform those with low ratings. The value of transparency is it keeps leaders and organizations honest with others and with themselves. It broadens perspectives, and it mitigates, in particular, against groupthink. Now, in practical terms, the information that those people who are at the top of organizations need at any given time is probably located someplace in an organization, in their organization, and that's one reason, obvious reason, why clear channels of communication are the sine qua non of organizational effectiveness. Thus, rationally, ethically, and in terms of organizational efficiency and effectiveness, transparency makes sense. So the question becomes, why aren't more companies addressing this issue? Why don't more companies address the common impediments that cause opacity to be the norm? Well, I think the reason is because transparency doesn't just happen. Because as Zimbardo demonstrates, this runs against the grain of human nature. In all groups, there's a powerful desire to belong. Everybody wants to be liked, they want to be part of the family, hence the pressure to conform in organizations is almost irresistible. Nobody wants to be the skunk at the party. No one wants to tell the boss his fly is open. No one wants to tell the boss that he's got a lump of peanut butter on his chin. So, at the top of hierarchies, leaders understandably want to hide their mistakes, and they want to prove that they're smarter than those below them, and hence they don't need their input. At the same time, leaders hoard information because they see that as a way of maintaining power. Fast trackers, golden boys, members of A-teams see information as a prerequisite of their positions. Thus, some of the organizations are in the know, they're the ones who get heard, while others are left out and become outsiders or outcasts, to the detriment of the entire organization and paradoxically even to the leaders themselves. Well, that's why Bennis, Goldman, and I document practical things that virtuous corporate barrel makers, that is leaders, can do to create cultures of candor. Now, what we have to say is far from new, but it goes against the grain of what social scientists in the mid-20th century were telling us. They had taught us that we should seek to create safe and secure business organizations, sort of feel-good lands that were homes of well-modulated voices, places for organization men where there was little or no conflict, and where those placid souls knew they had places for as long as they didn't rock the boat. Those organizations were built upon the basic desire of people to belong, to be seen as clubbable, to be one of the gang. Now recently, social scientist Joan Allaire has looked at data about one of those hallowed practices of the era. That was brainstorming. Remember brainstorming sessions? These were designed to be freewheeling events in which no one passed judgment on the quality of any ideas offered, and because people didn't fear being criticized for their ideas or fear being evaluated, the assumption was that this would lead to an outflow, a great outflow of creativity. Actually, no. Research shows that it is debate, criticism, dissent, and conflict that lead to creativity. Productive meetings are in fact characterized by diversity of views, competing perspectives, logical challenging, and candor. All that along with a lack of formal structure and hierarchy. Indeed, those characteristics turn out in general to be the characteristics of high-performance organizations. Whether the group in question is an Apple Corporation product development team, a team of research scientists, or a group of collaborators creating on a new Broadway musical. Lehrer concludes, and I'm quoting him now, with enough people with enough different perspectives running into one another in unpredictable ways, the group dynamics will take care of themselves. Errant discussions are the most essential part of the creative process. Such conversations will occasionally be unpleasant, but that doesn't mean that they can be avoided. It is the human friction that makes creative sparks fly. Now, in truth, we've known this for a very long time. For example, in 1859, John Stuart Mill, who I would say is arguably the greatest philosopher of the English-speaking world produced, devoted over half of this classic book on liberty to dissecting the ethical issues that he called collective tyranny. He said that tyranny characterized the behavior of most groups. whether they're religions, universities, businesses, or nations. He argued that membership in a group eventually results in, and I'm using his language here, the despotism of culture, the despotism of custom, and the ultimate dominance of superstition and mistaken self-interest. That is, unless eccentric individuals, that's his word for skeptics, doubters, rugged individualists, were encouraged to speak and protected when he or she chose to dissent from the norms and established wisdoms of the group, groupthink was bound to occur. He warned against the tyranny of the majority, which he feared was the mother of mediocrity and falsehood. Human excellence, he writes, social progress and creativity grow out of the ideas of people who dare to challenge the status quo. He goes on to say, the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it has contained. He likened the prevailing sentiments in his own Victorian England to the doctrine of the ancient Locrians. And you have to think about this for a minute. According to the ancient Locrians, there's a law that required, and I'm now quoting it, the propounder of a new truth or the proposer of a new law should stand with a noose around his neck to be tightened instantly if the public assembly did not, on hearing his reasons, then and there adopt his proposition. Or, may I say, in other words, this is a classical era foreshadowing of what happened to whistleblowers Sharon Watkins at Enron and Cynthia Cooper at WorldCon. Now, the libertarian Mill posited that it is not governments, nor is it bureaucratic power of the state that destroy the nonconformist. Instead, it is the ideology of organizational comfort. It is the tyranny of custom, which everywhere is a standing hindrance to human advancement. Now, that form of groupthink presents unceasing antagonism to those who have the disposition that aims for something better than is customary. Actually, we can simplify it as the old Japanese adage goes, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down. Now, hundreds of studies of human behavior have been conducted since the time of Mill. And to summarize their findings, we can say there is an overwhelming tendency for people and groups to unthinkingly subscribe to prevailing norms and beliefs and to protect their collective enterprises both from outside forces and divergent internal ideas. Humans and groups thus respond like antibodies in cells to the presence of a foreign antigen. Now, 300 years before Mill, Francis Bacon described the counterproductive nature of what he called the idols of the tribe and the idols of the marketplace. Now, these were the shared conceptions found in any group that eventually became what he called wonderful obstructions to the mind. Once a group supposition is established, Bacon wrote, every new fact adds support and confirmation to it, even though cogent and abundant instances exist to the contrary of those supposed facts. The collective mind does not observe, and in fact it despises these counter-arguments, or gets rid of them and rejects them with violent and injurious prejudice rather than sacrifice the authority of its first conclusion. Think Enron. Bacon's idols were what anthropologists in the early 20th century were to call collective representations. That is, the basic, unexamined, and accepted premises of a belief system. There's one famous book in this regard called Witchcraft Among the Azandi. It was written by an Oxford professor in about 1920. And he went to the Sudan to visit the Azandi people, who we would call, or they would call at that time, primitive peoples. And the reason they were called that is because they believed in witchcraft. They believed that an oracle could predict that somebody would get a terrible disease, or his house would burn down, or somebody would run off with his wife. As a matter of fact, if you paid the oracle enough, he would make the prediction and make it come true. Professor E.E. Evans Pritchard, I just love the name, had to say it. E.E. Evans Pritchard went and spent time with these people, learned their language, and studied what they were doing. And at the end, he wrote a book, and the conclusion of the book was actually the Azandi were right. She said that if you accept the premise of witchcraft, you can make everything else logically follow. So it has to do with the Azandi were able to use logic that would have impressed Aristotle. The whole question is, where do you start? What is that starting premise? Here's what Pritchard explained. He said, "Let the reader consider any argument that would utterly demolish all Zandi claims for the power of oracles. If it were translated into Zandi modes of thought, it would serve only to support their structure of belief." Okay? In other words, holding the same set of presuppositions, people and groups mutually conform each other's interpretation of experience. Now, you would say, well, you're way far away from the business world, Professor O'Toole. But I'd like to, if we could, just in the few minutes remaining with us, look briefly at the belief system of a primitive tribe that resided in Detroit, Michigan from 1910 until quite recently, when the tribe disintegrated into chaos. Now here gleaned, I'm just going to pass these around for your amusement. Here gleaned from the documents of the General Motors Corporation in the late 70s were the operating assumptions of the company in the 1980s. I tested these with the Senior Executive Vice President of Long-Term Planning, and he confirmed that, in fact, these were the major assumptions that people went into in almost all their meetings at the time. I will not go through them all, but if you do go through them, you will note that some of those assumptions were still there just before the company went belly up and they had to go to Washington to get a bailout. Right? They were still operating on these assumptions. My goodness. Now, there were more assumptions. Some were conscious, others inexplicit. But they are, of course, the guiding assumptions that helped to make GM the world's largest, most successful company in the middle years of the last century. Now, that success reinforced these assumptions and made them unchallenged. And in fact, it left them unchallengeable, even as the world changed and the company could not adapt to it. And it is that groupthink that led to the bizarre executive behavior that I cite by John DeLorean in the 1980s in the piece that I gave to you. And I'm just going to refer you to that because there is a little bit of foul language, and I don't want to upset anybody by quoting General Motors executives using foul language. Heavens no. Now, it is groupthink which, more than any other factor, stifles creativity, innovation, and limits organizational responsiveness to outside forces of change. It is that same tendency that stifles voices of dissenters or those who bring messages to the group that the group does not want to hear. And it is the tendency to insist on absolute loyalty to the organization's basic beliefs that leads to unthinking organizational misconduct and most clearly to attempts to justify or cover up moral and ethical wrongdoings. Significantly, these powerful social factors are inherent in human behavior, and thus they are not the byproduct of capitalism, nor are they the sole province of business organizations. If you want good examples, I can give you great ones from universities, I promise you. But as a business professor, I note that there has been an unfortunate tendency, particularly in this country, to view ethical concerns as add-ons, that is, separate from or at best adjunct concerns to the real world of business. At worst, ethical behavior has been portrayed as inconsistent with or in opposition to sound economic practices. Now, what Warren Bennis and I have tried to argue is no. In fact, good ethics is good business, or it can be made good business. What we have tried to show is that the practices and policies most likely to lead to ethical behavior are also those most likely to lead to good business decisions. Now, a culture of candor, we believe, is a fertile petri dish, not only for ethical behavior, but also for innovation, creativity, initiative, loyalty, and productivity as well. And such a culture is also poison for groupthink and the kinds of lies that lead to mistrust. So, based upon that idea, we posit that organizations need a free flow of information, much as a body requires a free flow of oxygen-bearing blood. Now, having said that, we have to recognize there are common impediments to creating that needed organizational openness. A lot of them, including organizational impediments such as hierarchy and bureaucracy, the treatment of dissenters as disloyal, and the obvious practical fact that shared values are a sine qua non of a functioning and healthy organization. So paradoxically, it is those strong values that you need to be effective are the same things that end up causing your sclerosis and your inability to deal with change and other ideas. There are also leaders who lack the self-confidence to listen to followers who bear unwelcome information. There are leaders who maintain power through hoarding information. And there are leaders whose egos simply will not permit their followers to speak truth to power. And, of course, it's more complicated than that. There's a shortage of willing speakers of truth. That is, followers with the moral courage to face retribution from their leaders and their organizations. All right. I'm just going to take, can I take 2 more minutes? Where is Dan? Can I take 2 more minutes?
As much time as you like.
Thank you. Okay. In the papers that you have there, I have a whole list of things that one can do to create cultures of candor, things that leaders can do to create greater transparency, to open up channels of information. A lot of these we've known for a very long time because it's a problem. These problems associated with it, the reason why they're so difficult to address is because they are so basic. Right? That 2,500 years ago, the Greeks were dealing with these same problems. Right? These are things that seem to be so much part of human nature, are part of human natures in groups. But it all seems to start with leaders. Right? It starts with leaders who are willing listeners. I'm going to read you this little passage from Sophocles' Antigone. This is the story of a king who is so rigid that he leads to his rigidity and his unwillingness to listen to anyone lead to not only the death of his son, the death of his daughter-in-law, death of his wife, and the downfall of his kingdom. And he will not listen to his son when his son warns him that the people are in revolt. The followers are outside, they want to be heard. And there were people in the room, including Antigone, his soon daughter-in-law-to-be, who have something to say. And this, the thing that will save his kingdom and save them. But Creon will not listen. Creon will not listen. And so his son says, then do not have one mind and one alone, that only your opinion can be right. Whoever thinks that he alone is wise, his eloquence, his mind above the rest, come the unfolding, shows his emptiness. A man, though wise, should never be ashamed of learning more, and must unbend his mind. Have you not seen the trees beside the torrent, the ones that bend them, saving every leaf, while the resistant perish root and branch? And so the ship that will not slacken sail, the sheet drawn tight, unyielding, overturns. She ends the voyage with her keel on top. No, Father, yield your wrath. Allow a change of stand. Young as I am, if I may give advice, I'd say it would be best if men were born perfect in wisdom. But failing this, which often fails, it can be no dishonor to learn from others when they speak good sense. So encouraging speaking to truth, power, something that all leaders have to learn. There's a little joke in one of the papers that is there about Samuel Goldwyn. When MGM was in trouble, Samuel Goldwyn called in his top managers and he said, well, tell us what's going on here. He says, we're losing money left and right. What is it? What is it? He says, I want you to tell me the truth, even though it's going to cost you your job. Some leaders actually reward contrarians. Telling another story in there about Bob Galvin when he was the CEO of Motorola, one of the finest CEOs I've ever worked with. Bob looked like he came right out of Central Casting, handsome man. He got the company, became CEO the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. And walking down the hallway with Bob one day, and a young kid came up, about the age of some of my MBA students right now, and the kid buttonholes the great man, and he said, Bob, I heard what you had to say this morning, and it's dead wrong. I'm going to prove it. I'm going to shoot you down. The kid walks off, and I look over, and I said, oh, my God, the kid's career's kaput. You don't talk that way to the boss. I look over and Galvin is beaming. And I said, well, what's going on? And he said, that's how we've overcome Texas Instruments as the world's leading producer of semiconductors, which they were at the time. And he said, nobody gets ahead here by telling us we're doing things right. He said, the rewards go to the people who dare to tell us when the emperor is wearing no clothes. He says, and we may not like hearing it, but we understand that that is what we need to do. We want to encourage people to speak truth to power. We have to create a climate of trust where people can actually have unpleasant conversations. Probably the nicest documentation of all this is in Lou Gerstner's recent book about IBM, a place that is that land of the well-modulated voice, okay? the place, where people were never honest with themselves. It was this, about as artificial and self-contained and hermetically sealed place that you could imagine. And Lou Gerstner walks in and he understands that it's going to require straight talk, objective measures, and how he takes 10 years to break down that culture by finally getting people to not speak in terms of codes, not to go through bureaucracy, but to actually talk about objective numbers. Opening up the flows of communication, information help. In there we describe the SRC holdings, open book management. We can talk about later if you're interested in that. With John Mackey's posting of salaries at Whole Foods has had a very, very positive impact. Understanding leaders who clearly never shoot messengers, who admit that they're wrong, who admit that they don't know everything, the sort of anti-creons. And we had Howard Schultz in here last year, and Howard Schultz starts off by taking the blame himself for what happened, the trouble that Starbucks got into a couple of years ago. Doesn't put the blame on anybody else, talks about himself, takes it all on himself. Right? And then when we presented him with things, questions, he said, we were wrong, we made a mistake. Right? Okay, it's that sort of candor, that sort of openness leading from the top that helps create the kinds of openness of information and flow that leads to organizational candor. There's a hell of a lot more that we can talk about, and I've already talked far too long. But Warren and I said, being students of Samuel Goldwyn, you've got to get, if you can't get it on the back of an envelope, the message in the back of an envelope, it's probably not a very good one. So we came up with a single rule of information in organizations, and that is, when in doubt, let it out.